wanna bust a nut, what about me? Baby, what's your fantasy? Baby, what's your fantasy? You want your
The fantasy life. Welcome to the Colombian Code. El Código Colombiano. Now, I felt it only right that we should do this very first episode here in Medellin. As someone who's lived and done business here for over a decade, Medellin will always hold a special place in my heart. But now that I'm free to roam the digital jungle, I have a few things that I'd like to address. Now, before I get started, I want everyone to understand what I mean when I talk about fantasy versus reality. See, when I first came to Medellin back in '07, most people probably only ever heard one thing about Colombia. Fast forward to today, in this post-pandemic social media dominant era, and I'm willing to bet everyone has not only heard of Colombia, but has some sort of image of Colombia and what they perceive it to be. This is a fantasy, and it's my main motivation for starting this channel, to separate fantasy from reality. Now, when I refer to what I call the fantasy, I specifically mean three things: girls, drugs, parties. This is the fantasy. It's what 90% of my clients would come here for. Now, I'm not trying to knock anyone who wants to live the fantasy life. In fact, I've always said Colombia is one of the best places in the world if you want to live the fantasy. But just remember and understand the reality of what it is, and don't get caught up. Because the fantasy is like a drug. But we'll talk more about that in the next episode. But before I go, I want to talk a bit about James Bond. Yeah, this guy. See, this is a recurring theme that I've seen appear with regards to not only Colombia, but fantasy tourists in general. It's the idea that you can just hop on a plane and escape your boring reality by being flown to some exotic foreign land where you can live like James Bond himself. Well, let me be the first to say that James Bond is a fantasy. It's a fictional character that was written by Ian Fleming back in the 50s. That's not reality. The real MI6 agent bears little resemblance to the fictional 007 character that so many of us fantasize over today. And now you know. So when people try to sell you a fantasy, understand that's exactly what it is, a fantasy. Now that we all understand the difference between fantasy and reality, we can move on to more interesting topics of conversation, like hookers and hood rats. So stay tuned till the next episode. Salud.